Alright, YouTube, there's even more Fukushima news now to report. Literally, there was a lull there for about a month, and now you're getting more news than ever, even more than the last round of news about the problems at this plant. I'll put several links in the description. The first is that right now a very, very large typhoon is headed for Japan. They're not sure whether it will track more north and it will hit the other side of the island, or whether it's going to track more northeast, in which case it's going to go right across Tokyo and Fukushima. Um, and there's a tropical depression basically right next to it that they're saying could, in theory, merge with this other storm. I'm not sure. I'm not a meteorologist, so I wouldn't know such a thing, but people are saying that it's possible that the two storms could converge, uh, making an even more powerful storm, which would mean it could make landfall above tropical storm levels and be Category 1, Category 2 hurricane. This follows on the tail, of course, of the last typhoon that hit not even a week ago, which they said was a once-in-10-year storm, and it drenched the whole area. The other piece of news from this, well, there are two. First is that there was apparently some sort of mudslide fairly close to the Fukushima power plant. Not clear what damage was actually done, but the ground is being eroded by all of these constant storms. It seems to be an elevated storm year, because last year you didn't really hear much about typhoon after typhoon pummeling this particular spot on the island. It's very strange. They all seem to go across this area, which stretches from Tokyo to Fukushima. Of course, Tokyo has its own problems when it gets that level of rain. But it apparently caused some sort of mudslide relatively close to the plant. Of course, the plant itself isn't right next to any hills, but there are hills back behind it some, and the roads leading into that area could potentially be blocked. Now you've got another typhoon headed for it within the next 24 to 48 hours. You'll start seeing clouds begin to form over that region, and then soon after you'll have drenching rain potentially if it actually hits the area. The other thing is they underestimated the amount of rain that was going to fall, TEPCO did, at the Fukushima plant. They underestimated the amount of rain that was going to fall, and apparently there were 12 different locations on the site where water was flooding these barriers that they've set up, because the water around these storage tanks is from mildly to moderately radioactive. Apparently at 12 different locations it was spilling out, because TEPCO only has the ability to pump so much of this contained fluid, some of which I'm presuming is the result of leaks from the storage tanks. They're only capable of pumping a certain amount per day because of the limitations of the relatively makeshift design of these pumps that they're using. Well, they underestimated the amount of rain that was going to fall, and some of this water, of course, was all around the plant, and the workers were sloshing around in rubber boots, trying to keep radioactive material from touching their skin. Anyone can see why well, for one thing, if this storm merges with the tropical depression and does become some sort of bizarre superstorm, and dumps even more rain and there's more wind, that the steel bracing around that particular chimney that they've got on site that apparently is coming loose, that could collapse. Cranes could get knocked over. It could peel, could damage the vehicles on which there are actually mounted generators on the backs of trucks, essentially powering the things that are going on at this site. They're all at risk. The roads going into and out of Fukushima could get blocked by mudslides, preventing proper equipment movement and people from moving to and from the area if necessary, if they have to evacuate or put more people there because something's going wrong. The problems at the site just keep mounting up. And you're hearing a lot, and again, because I'm not strictly speaking a conspiracy theorist, I'm more hesitant to label this a result of Fukushima. But there are, well, earlier this year there was quite a large die-off of sea lions on the west coast, showing symptoms that are similar to radiation exposure. It's not clear. They tested them for diseases. No diseases were apparently found, You'd think logically the next step would be to test for, oh, did they eat radioactive fish? Apparently they either didn't do that or didn't release the results to the public. I wonder why. There have been several oarfish, which are extremely deep sea dwelling, extremely rare fish that have washed up on the shores, I believe, of California. This is an extremely rare event when an oarfish washes up. They inhabit the very deepest depths of the ocean. They're extremely large serpentine fish, and you've got two washing up in less than a week. It does seem rather strange. Again, no way to tell for sure if it's linked to Fukushima in any way. It could be that radioactivity is fucking with ocean ecosystems. But because the governments of the Western world fund most of the places that would have the ability to test for radiation, if they didn't want us to know that this was the cause of this die-off, they wouldn't tell us. But yes, there is another typhoon scheduled to make landfall in Japan. If things go well, hopefully it will track the other direction and it won't actually get near the Fukushima area. It'll still bring high wind, relatively speaking. It'll still bring high wind, some rain, but it wouldn't, completely destroy the area. The problem is you keep having typhoon after typhoon. In an area where they're already pumping it full of water, there are barriers preventing some of that water from getting back out. And they're running out of storage space because every time one of these typhoons comes through, they do have to pump this into the storage tanks. They estimate the amount of rain that's going to fall, and they say, well, we need to pump about that same amount back out to prevent it from spilling because of the contamination in these pools around the storage tanks. They're running out of room. Every typhoon means that they're running out of more room faster. And eventually, and let's face it, these tanks, they are temporary storage tanks. They're bolted together. They really shouldn't have been used in the first place. They were going to use fully welded designs. Unfortunately, they couldn't get enough of them fast enough, I guess, and they used the bolted ones. They're leaking all the time, and they're filling more and more of these tanks with this less radioactive, yes, waste, but some of these tanks, they're filling it with material they cannot pump back out to sea because it is too contaminated. In some cases, they've released material into the ocean during storms. That depends on the radioactivity readings from those individual tanks. If they're too radioactive, they just can't do that. So you've got hundreds and hundreds of tanks holding many, many tens of thousands of tons, maybe might be over 100,000 tons of this material on site. You've got continual weather problems, and again, it was pointed out not long ago that during the winters at this site, because of cold weather, these unshielded pipes sometimes burst. The ones that are controlling water going into and out of the reactors, the ones that keep them cool to prevent them from steaming off the water and catching fire or doing something else that's crazy. You've got all the hallmarks of a badly managed situation here. And the media largely ignores the issue. Number one, because I'm sure that their government handlers have told them, oh, we don't want the public hearing too much about this. And number two, it's not as exciting. Unless one of these buildings actually blows its top, like Unit 3 did, when they're transferring the fuel rods or whatever, unless something like that happens, it's simply less exciting than Miley Cyrus twerking or the government shutdown or any of these other things that people are so focused on. The problem being, if we read into these signs that we're seeing a little bit, die-off of fish, radioactivity readings on the West Coast, certainly, and we do a little bit of elementary reasoning and a little bit of elementary math and compare this situation to Chernobyl, we see that the amount of radioactivity released directly into the Pacific Ocean, plus continued release, 300 to 400 tons of contaminated water a day, sometimes more, depends on the weather, they're not sure. If we read into that, we can see, yes, there is the potential for problems in the ocean, first and foremost. The mismanagement of the site, in all aspects, could contribute to additional problems on land, number two. Number three, the moral turpitude with which TEPCO is operating right now. with workers being supposedly overworked, underpaid. Some of these people, it's been claimed that some of these people are essentially going without pay because TEPCO simply doesn't have the funds to pay them. The complicity of the government of Japan in largely ignoring the issue, telling people that it's perfectly okay, that there's nothing to worry about, and the complicity of other Western governments too, saying, well, the level of radioactivity released is inert, it's not going to hurt you. That depends on your own lifestyle choices. If you're eating a great deal of Pacific caught seafood, it probably is harmful to you. If you're drinking a great deal of milk that comes from Washington State, they have found cesium in that milk. It's going to keep building up. The cows excrete it into the milk. That could cause a problem because, of course, and I said this in a previous video, where does most of that milk go? It goes to babies and little kids that are more affected by radiation. These aren't complicated issues. You don't need a PhD in nuclear physics to understand these things, or a PhD in cancer-related medicine or something. You don't need any specific training at all. It's a little bit of common sense. You can compare the events at Fukushima to Chernobyl. More radioactivity by far was released at Fukushima, and even the estimates given by the Western world at large, by TEPCO, the government of Japan, and of course accepted largely by other Western governments, are probably wrong. Especially any estimate given by TEPCO when they continuously underestimate every risk at this site, from the radioactivity of the site itself, from the radioactivity of this leak in the chimney, the radioactivity of the reactors, the radioactivity of the storage tanks, the radioactivity in the area of the bay surrounding the Fukushima site. Why would you then, if they're underestimating all of these things, and largely ignoring the health issues to the general public, because something like 40% of children that were living in that area are now showing thyroid problems, which is another thing that most people haven't heard about, and there should be great public outcry, and simply the American public doesn't care because they haven't seen it on the news, because the media doesn't care. If you use a little bit of common sense, you can see TEPCO is simply not to be trusted. The Japanese medical community, although they probably mean well, is also not to be trusted, because these doctors are claiming that they've been told deliberately by the government not to tell people when their health problems are probably linked to exposure to strontium and cesium and all these other goodies that came out of Fukushima. At least that's the claim. They're claiming that they've been muzzled, essentially, that they've been warned that they're not going to be practicing medicine very long, and by the way, Japan does not have a particularly strong history of human rights. It's a developed country. It's a technologically capable country. It's a country that's in the sphere of Western influence. But for some reason, we're overlooking the fact that doctors are claiming that they're not allowed to tell patients that, yeah, your gigantic swollen thyroid is the result of iodine exposure. They're not allowed to tell them that. Or you got leukemia. Sorry, it had nothing to do with Fukushima melting down. And people are claiming they've been harassed and thrown in jail for relatively long periods for even being part of activist groups that are, because Japan, and I think most people here don't understand this, is largely controlled by the nuclear lobby. Japan does not have a great deal of fuel resources on their homeland. Japan doesn't have substantial coal reserves. It doesn't have substantial oil reserves. It doesn't have really any natural gas. It doesn't even mine its own uranium. Japan is reliant upon nuclear power sponsored by groups that are co-opted from outside of Japan to supply their power needs. Although now that they've closed down all their plants, they're still not seeing any real power problems because they've got extremely conservation-minded goals in place, telling people basically don't use any more electricity and water than you have to, which is a sane idea anyway because the island's completely overpopulated. But people don't seem to care. And it makes no sense because when you look at the amount of material that was probably released, and you have to assume if you're reasonable, that TEPCO has severely underestimated the release of total nuclear material, there is enough there to cause problems in the entire North Pacific. We say this because we can look at Chernobyl and say a much smaller release caused great problems over quite a wide land area. And on the land, there's the tendency for some of that radioactivity to sink down into the ground to a level where it's no longer entering biological systems directly, because the roots of the plants aren't taking it up. It literally goes past them. In the ocean, it's not that way. The plankton and the coral and all of these things filter water as it goes by and trap every particle that goes through it that isn't H2O or salt, for Christ's sake. They're sequestering this radioactive material. Then, the coral dies because it's too radioactive and stops functioning. Some bottom feeder comes along and nibbles up all the dead coral or crustaceans or whatever, and it just keeps going back into the biological systems. It's bioaccumulation. It's more potent. This is my own belief. It would be more potent in the ocean than on land, simply because the radioactive particles are not sinking down into the muck only to be forgotten forever because of the volatility of the environment in which this radioactive material is found. There was that one article by the Australian yachting, the dude who had a yacht, he was going out on his usual cruise from Australia to Japan and all around the Pacific, because he likes to do that, saying there was debris everywhere, presumably from the tsunami washing things out from Japan on that fateful day. That there were fish with tumors and shit, that there were all sorts of dead fish, and that the area was being overfished anyway, but that a lot of this, they said they saw a whale with a giant tumor on its head. No way to verify it, but presumably it's possible, given the level of radioactivity that is entering into the type of species that a whale would normally eat. It's self-explanatory. It's self-explanatory that this is going to cause problems. You have to be a fool to think that it's not going to fuck something up when you've got that level of radioactivity not only in Japan fucking with people, but also out at sea that is totally screwing with sea life. It just makes sense, and as this next typhoon approaches, you're probably going to see more strontium and tritium and all this stuff in the groundwater spiking, sloshing out into the ocean. You're going to see these tanks flood. You could see anything could suddenly fall over as the result of soil liquefaction. And TEPCO just sits by with its thumb up its ass and does absolutely nothing. Because my other prediction is this: they're simply managing the site into failure. They understand they cannot solve most of the problems at this site, so even if they manage to successfully extract these assemblies from all of these fuel pools around the site, that's good, it's better than nothing. There's still the corium, there's still radioactivity in the soil, in the ocean, and in the groundwater. And it's something that they don't seem to have we're not sure, the money, the manpower, the support, the time, or the will to actually solve. Peace out.